Good evening. Good evening. Hi guys, it's my time now. Thanks. All right, good evening. My name is Julia Mercer, and I am a student project manager at the Clarke Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. On behalf of the Clarke Forum, the Student Senate, the Psychology Club, Psi Chi, and the Wellness Center, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, The Myth of the Violent Athlete. Clarke Forum student project managers and supervisors, including Gianna Toglia, Rehoboth Gassasa, Shelby Friedel, and myself, initiated this program. As all of you probably remember, the scandals of former Atlanta Falcons quarterback Michael Vick, of Minnesota Vikings running back Adrian Peterson, of former Baltimore Ravens running back Ray Rice, and of Olympic sprint runner Oscar Pistorius. The list goes on and on. Media outlets constantly report on the violent transgressions of athletes. With the intense media scrutiny placed on these stories, one wonders if athletes are more violent than non-athletes. Dr. Mitch Abrams would contend that this is a myth, and that athletes are not more violent, but that complex circumstances create this apparent correlation. It is such an honor to introduce Dr. Abrams, who is the leading psychologist in his field. My fellow student project managers and I have been working for several semesters to bring Dr. Abrams to Dickinson, and we are so happy he could join us tonight. Abrams is the president and founder of the sports psychology consulting firm Learned Excellence for Athletes, which helps professional, collegiate, and high school athletes, teams, and coaches reach their fullest potential. He is also a licensed psychologist in New York and New Jersey, assistant professor of psychiatry at the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, and the clinician administrator for University Correctional Health, which places him in charge of the mental health services for 5 New Jersey state prisons. Abrams is a member of the American Psychological Association, the Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, and the Association of Applied Sports Psychology, where he founded and chairs a special interest group on anger and violence in sport. His expertise is widely sought after, and he has contributed to the Encyclopedia of Sports Medicine and the Sports Psych Handbook, in addition to publishing his own book entitled Anger Management in Sport: Understanding and Controlling Violence in Athletes. This book is unique in its in-depth, complex picture of sports violence within the context of societal pressures, substance abuse, and mental illness, as well as in its effective counseling methods, which work to increase athletic performance while decreasing violence. At this time, I would like to ask that you please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. After the talk, we will have a question and answer session, so please hold all questions until that time. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mitch Abrams.
That was some introduction, huh? It's all going downhill from here. Okay, so first I want to thank all of you for being here today. I'm hoping that this is a talk that you find interesting and thought-provoking. Obviously, I want to thank Dickinson University and all of the people that have been involved in corresponding with me and setting this date to be possible. We've been talking about it for quite a while. My talk today, I hope, is going to be a little bit redundant in that it's hard to pay attention to the media at all and not assume, or at least believe, the perception that athletes are a violent bunch. It's not true. It's not true. We're going to talk about what the definition of an athlete is. We're going to talk about violence. We're going to be trying to expand this conversation to not just about violence and anger management, but as well as different types of violence that athletes are sometimes involved in, including dating violence and sexual assault, which are topics that are of great interest and import on college campuses. Before anything else, I want to make sure that everyone understands what my position is ahead of time. There is a tremendous difference between an explanation and an excuse. We're not in the business of trying to excuse violent behavior. I work in the prison system. I cannot undo what a judge decides. And let's not forget that many acts of violence never get before the criminal justice system in the first place. But I think it's of monumental importance to understand the explanations that go into violent behavior, because that's where the intervention is. So the more we're able to understand the explanations and the factors and the criminogenic issues that contribute to behavior, the better we will be able to make this problem go away. However, at least from a sexual assault on college campuses point of view, this problem hasn't gotten any better in the last 30 or 40 years, which tells us, and we should also remember that that's while people are coming forward a little bit more. So we've been doing the same thing for 30, 40 years, and we haven't been able to solve this problem. So we have to change things. My hope is that by the end of this conversation, and I hope that it's a conversation that will have an active question and answer period, you leave here with some disagreements, some opinions, some thoughts, some emotions. I hope to piss some of you off if I'm successful. That was a joke. But it's important that this is the beginning, not the end of a conversation, and that you take this with you amongst your friends and change the social groups that you're in so that we're really able to get along just a little bit better. And when we do have situations that someone transgresses, there should be no confusion that the blame falls completely on the shoulders of the perpetrator, not the victim. Exclamation point. Okay. So the factors that we have that contribute to this idea that athletes are a violent bunch is that the media certainly portrays it that way. There's the belief that athletes are disproportionately represented in criminal populations. I work in 5 state prisons. We're not overrun by athletes. And athletes always get off, that there's this idea of athlete privilege. It's not difficult to extend that to the idea that sports are bad. And if you extend that further, competition is the devil. How many of you in here identify yourselves as athletes? You're all bad. No? Competition, good or bad? I agree. But when you have the transgression of a few, especially when it's particularly poor behavior, people will sometimes use heuristics. They will try to oversimplify. They'll use a broad stroke of a brush, and they'll identify a group of people as those that do this, instead of the factors that go into the individual's personality that might lead to that behavior. I think it would be a complete travesty if at the end of the day, sometime from now, people eradicate sports, because the conclusion is that the negatives outweigh the positives. I don't believe that's true. You can't go to any culture in the world and not find people playing games and sports. It's inherent to the human condition. And for those of you that are students in here, let me remind you that success is not going to drop in your lap. And sports give you an opportunity to compete, learn how to fail, build resilience, get back up, and go get your goals. So I'm a little bit of a fan of that. And I hope that you are too. That doesn't mean that you're not going to have a certain amount of people inside any population to transgress. So if we're going to consider athletes a violent bunch, let's first realize how ridiculous that statement is. How do we define an athlete? A person trained or skilled in exercises, sports or games requiring physical attributes such as strength, agility, and or stamina. So where's the line? Professional athletes? Well, there's not that many of them, right? How about collegiate athletes? Numbers getting bigger. 44 million kids played youth sports. 28.6 million golfers. Is the 75-year-old marathoner an athlete? Is that your picture of psychopathy and rageful violence? It's generally not what comes to mind for me. All of the people that are running marathons competitively, non-competitively, the point I'm making is that athletics and sports are a huge part of our population and our culture. So if you're going to say that athletes are a violent bunch, then you're going to be talking about a whole lot of people, and America is already the country that incarcerates the highest percentage of their population than anywhere else. And if you're going to follow your logic that athletes are a violent bunch, we're going to need more prisons. Because it's not true. So when people are saying athletes are more violent than non-athletes, it begs the question of who exactly we're talking about. And sometimes you'll hear people try to refine that and say, well, it's those that are engaged in contact sports. And the longer the conversation goes, it eventually gets pasteurized down to men playing collision sports. So you probably want to know what the data is on that. That's called foreshadowing. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that, but I'm also going to talk to you about why the research is particularly poor. Okay. 2 college students get pulled over for DUI. The athlete, everyone's going to know about it. A friend of mine, a colleague, a sports psychologist at one unnamed Big Ten school, used to tell me that he gets all of his referrals from watching SportsCenter. If I get a DUI, it's not on the news. So there's certainly the issue that the media has a double standard, and that media swarms on athletes, especially when they do something scandalous. Athletes are held to a different standard. They need to behave better than their peers. Now think about this for a second. From the time an athlete is identified as being physically gifted and different from their peers, they immediately start getting a different set of rules. Now, whether it's you, that you've experienced it, or your friends, you've seen it in your neighborhood, and once they start getting a different set of rules, they start to believe it. So if I am better than you, and I'm better than you, and I'm better than you, eventually I start to believe I'm better than everyone. Narcissism is a natural consequence of chronic winning. When you beat everyone, you think you're the best. So if you want to blame athletes for that, you might want to blame society a little bit too, because we're putting people on pedestals. The idea that because someone is physically gifted means that they're psychologically healthy is a non sequitur. It's not always true. Now, athletes might complain and say, well, that's not fair. You shouldn't put me on a pedestal and give me a different set of rules. You're right. It's also not fair that a professional athlete makes millions of dollars a year playing a game while a teacher who's going to try to change the future is making 50 grand. So athletes that have to deal with the burden of greater visibility are going to have to learn to adjust to it, drive defensively, and be even better prepared. So even though I don't believe athletes are more violent than non-athletes, I think they're at risk because people think that they're not. If you take a look at how data has been presented different ways over the years, about 100. That's read wrong. You have 15,000 U.S. professional athletes. About 100 get arrested for domestic violence every year. That's a rate of 0.007 arrests per athlete. That's what your normal rate is among the general public. I'm going to show you this data for NFL athletes in a little while. The data is undeniable, that even at the pinnacle of revenue-producing professional athletes, they're arrested at a lower rate than the general public. That doesn't even say anything about guilt or conviction. And if you want to have a conversation about some of the problems in the criminal justice system, we can talk about that as well. But I would argue that when you deal with professional athletes, you need to compare them to other celebrities that have the ability to afford representation that, frankly, I don't have. And so they might be able to get more leniency because of the representation that they have. You may not know who I am, but you should know who this guy is. Richard Lapchick is probably the single greatest sports sociologist in our country. He developed the Mentors in Violence Prevention program up at Northeastern University, and now is at University of Central Florida, developing more centers for social awareness. And so even from his position, even if you consider that the police may go easy on athletes, it's very clear it's not a disproportionate representation. So let's also consider that I told you I'm going to be talking about lots of different types of violence, not just sexual violence. What exactly is violence and where does it come from? Let's start with language. How many of you, by a show of hands, have gotten in trouble for being angry? You're not really showing your hands. There's cameras here, guys. Put up your hands. None of you have gotten in trouble for being angry. You might have gotten in trouble for the things that you do when you're angry. We have an epidemic in our country. Nobody knows how to talk about how they're feeling. And probably no emotion gets more shame, besides shame, than anger. So if we're going to understand anger management, we're going to understand violence, we have to talk about what the definitions are. And one of the things that I would remind you is that when you have the opportunity to write a book, you can make your own definitions. Why do I bring this up? I'll tell you why. The historical definitions of aggression in sports psychology literature, in psychology literature, and almost everywhere you look, defines aggressiveness as its goal to harm someone else. What's the opposite of being aggressive? Being passive. How many of you believe that being passive is going to lead you to be successful in life? Right. So the problem is not being aggressive. The question is what kind of aggressiveness it is. We're going to talk about that more in a second. So anger is a normal emotion. You have a physiological reaction to a provocative stimulus. Different people experience anger differently, some internalized, some externalized, but no one gets in trouble for being angry. And the more you talk about it, you'll hear sometimes people say, oh, well, the person's really depressed and it's externalized. I think that that has more to do with just distraction around the fact that people have difficulty owning the fact that they're angry. And the best example that I think proves this is when you see someone who's clearly upset and you say, hey, why are you so angry? What's their response? It's more than that. It's cursing. I'm not effing angry, right? I don't own it, I deny it, I project it. And wouldn't it be so nice if they said, well, you know, I had a hard day, I'm kind of tired, I'm not getting enough sleep, my boss is annoying, my professors don't care about what I'm putting down on paper, I'm kind of frustrated. Well, that at least gives you an opportunity to talk about things and make some change. But people don't own and talk about being angry. Perhaps no emotion has more judgment put on it than anger. And I think that that's the issue. Anybody who tells you that there's such a thing as good and bad emotions, run. It's just not true. The question really is, how much, and is it helping you? And athletes, performers, people that are successful, understand this. And I'll explain why having problems with anger interferes with sports performance, which is why if you have too big of an anger problem, you wind up being self-selected out of sports. Where does anger come from? It's a simple construct, really. It only comes from one place, right? I am giving you a truncated list. Parents, environment, drugs and alcohol. By the way, alcohol doesn't cause people to be violent. Alcohol doesn't make you an idiot. Alcohol makes it impossible for you to hide the fact that you're an idiot. There's a difference. Anybody see that little plug right there? Anger comes from Brooklyn, right? Okay. The point I'm making is that this is an incomplete list. We're complex people. We're social people. We're working with multiple factors that are influencing us all of the time. So to think that anger management is going to be very simple because it just comes from one place is not accurate. I was serious about Brooklyn. So let's move ahead. Aggression then, I think about aggression, I'm thinking passion, tenacity. It's the hunger with which people go after their goals. It does not have to have harming another as part of its goal. It can, but it doesn't have to. So let's break it down. So instrumental aggression is the goal-directed aggression when you have something that you're going after. You interview anybody that's been successful and you're going to hear them talk about how hungry they are. You give me two people that are equally talented. The one who's hungrier, the one who wants it more, is going to be the one who's more successful. So let's stop acting like being aggressive is a bad thing. Not to be confused with reactive aggression, which has as its goal to specifically harm someone. That someone says something bad about you and you get up and you have to smack him in the head. That's reactive aggression. That's connected to anger. That's where the problem lies. So even when we talk about anger management, we're really not saying anger management. We're really saying reactive aggression management. Make sense? Because no one gets in trouble for emotions, they get in trouble for what they do. It's about changing behavior. So, if we have instrumental aggression versus reactive aggression, how does that lead to success in sport and in life? Well, if you increase instrumental aggression, you get an increase in athletic success. You increase in reactive aggression, you get penalties, mental mistakes. That goes up, sports success goes down. Violence, however, is just an extreme form of reactive aggression. But that's incomplete also, because there are different types of violence. Predatory violence. Do you know what a predator is? When a cat is hunting a bird, they're not in a rage. It's exactly the opposite. They're physiologically quiet. So one of the things that you also have to consider, and I was talking on the way over here, is that there's a lot of violence that doesn't have anger in it at all. Sexual violence is usually not about anger, it's about power. Okay? So what we differentiate sometimes between affective violence, which is related to anger, and predatory violence, which is a very different thing. And when you talk about behavior that's antisocial, what's happening is the individual is saying, I'm going to do what I want to do, and I don't care about society's rules. It's not rageful. You just have to give me what I want. Okay? And this definition, I think, is most helpful because any of you hockey fans? Is that not like the confusing sport in the world when it comes to violence? Is fighting allowed? Is it not allowed? Well, it depends on the level and what the refs call. So sports violence is harm-inducing behavior outside the rules of sport, bearing no direct relationship to the competitive goals of sport. So now we have set the stage for what's acceptable and what's not. Warning, when you say something's a new model, don't present something that's over 10 years old. How many of you have seen my model before? Right, so it's brand new. In sports, you could break violence down into hostile versus incidental. You know, you could see times that in hockey, as the example, you have a really hard check, and it's violent, but the goal is not to harm. But this, when people are trying to harm one another in the heat of the moment, that happens. But it's very different when it's spontaneous, when the athlete's doing it, than when it's planned, when the coach says, bounty on his head, take him out of the game. When this happens, and by the way, this happens more than anybody wants to admit, you have a systems failure. If you want to change violence in sports, you need top-down and bottom-up interventions. You still have coaches that are teaching this type of nonsense. The most common way that people coach is the way they were coached. Practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent. Perfect practice makes perfect. So if you want to change the way athletes act, you got to change the way coaches are taught. And let me also say that what I'm talking about here, and the slides that I'm coming up to are going to demonstrate it, that coaches that don't understand this are leaving money on the table because you're far more successful when you're at peak performance, and that means emotional balance. Hostility. I have to wrap up my definitions. You know those people that wake up on the wrong side of the bed every single day? It's not just me. Hostility is more of a personality style, but one of the things that we know about people that have chronic anger problems is they have a cognitive distorted set. They're more likely, and we call it a hostility bias, they're more likely to perceive neutral stimuli as threatening, provoking, and they're likely to act accordingly. They're not able to give you a list of other options instead of violence being the way to solve problems. They legitimize violence. They're also not going to be able to give you other explanations for things that could have caused it. You'll see two kids walking down the hall, one bumps into the other. Hey man, I'm sorry, why'd you bump into, why'd you bump into me? I'm sorry, I didn't see you there. And it has to escalate, because one of the things, especially with guys, is that it's all about pride and personal power and reputation. Let me tell you something, the toughest guy in prison doesn't have to fight. Real power is when people don't want to mess with you. And guys that have buttons that are easy to push are probably the most fragile of the group. Okay? Like I said, they believe that violence is an acceptable way of doing things. Now, sometimes in the literature you'll say, well, when you say instrumental aggression, you really mean assertiveness. No, I don't. Assertiveness has to do with standing up for your rights, communication skills, that you advocate for yourself. When you're playing sports, are you really going to say, excuse me, Mr. Goalie, could you please move out of the way? I would really like to put this ball in the net right now. No. Assertiveness training can be helpful for athletes when they have to talk to people like coaches. And the truth is that there are sometimes that athletes stick out their chests and act like they're tough and they're really scared. And they really have anxiety issues. So assertiveness training is a skill that we teach for folks, for athletes that might struggle with anxiety or even anger, because it's important to have those communication skills. But don't think for a second assertiveness is the same thing as instrumental aggression. The people who say that are the same ones that don't want to say out loud that aggressiveness is okay. That's what I said. Okay. No psychologist is allowed to give a presentation without throwing words around to confuse people. Interesting, sports psychology is a relatively young field compared to general psychology. The Yerkes-Dodson law has been around for a century. Sports psychologists come along later and say, we have the inverted U hypothesis. Any of you know anything about scientific theory? Which outranks which, a theory, a law, or a hypothesis? Ah, right, so the hypothesis, you come along, oh look, we have a hypothesis. You've moved backwards. What this says, there's a curvilinear relationship between arousal and performance, okay? We're talking about physiological arousal. And this will make everything clear to you about anger if you remember that anger is an okay emotion. What we find is that people tend to not do their best work when they first wake up in the morning. How many of you have classes before 10 a.m.? How many of you drink coffee? Many of the same people. That's okay. You're not alone. It's hard to focus your attention when you're in a low energy state. But what people don't realize, let me jump back for a second, is that the same thing is true at very high energy levels. So let's use anger for example. If you are an athlete, does anger help you or hurt you? I'm sorry, let me take a step back. Remember these two words. It depends. If you remember those two words, you will be right no matter what question anybody ever asks you. So, does anger help or hurt an athlete's performance? Thank you. At moderate levels, anger can increase strength, speed, stamina, decrease the perception of pain. That helps. Would you agree? But there's a cliff that people fall off of. And there's some differences for each person, and it depends on the task at hand. But at very high levels of arousal, what goes out the window is fine motor coordination, problem solving, decision making, vision. When I say vision, I mean the ability to take in data, synthesize it, and make a decision in a short period of time. The cognitive skills that go into sports performance go down the tubes when this gets too high. So when we talk about emotions and the impact that they have on performance, this, bless you, this is where the zone of optimal functioning is for most people, for most tasks. But you should be mindful that this whole thing will move a little bit depending on the task and will depend on the person. There are some people that are very, very sensitive to their emotions, and this might be very narrow. This is a general rule about performance, but you need to understand it doesn't tell the whole story. Now, how does it play out from a task point of view? All right. There you have a defensive lineman. Any defensive linemen in the room? Good, we could talk about them. Not a lot of decisions you have to make. Oversimplification of the job. Throw man in front of you out of the way, kill guy with ball. Not a lot of decisions. In fact, there's some research that shows the further you go away from the line of scrimmage, the lower the level of anger, because there's less decisions you have to make. So for someone that doesn't have to make a lot of decisions and you need brute strength, fast twitch muscle stuff, that's fine. One of the big problems is that a lot of coaches are rah-rah coaches. They try to amp you up, they try to get you excited, and then they put your butt on the bench when you jump off sides. No one teaches you to modulate your emotions. Depending on your task, sometimes it's fine. But let's say you're a golfer. Now it's in the way. Ironically, golfers tend to be a very angry bunch. Anybody who's ever tried to hit a ball, a golf ball, a far distance, you know that the margin of error is very, 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 very small. It's very frustrating, okay? They are going to be even, especially in the short game for putting, it's all about precision. So levels of anger are going to interfere more. The moral of the story here is that anger is not good or bad. The question is how much, depending on the task at hand. Anybody people in here like steak? Anyone besides me? All right. Anger is like fire, okay? It can be very productive. Can't make a good steak without hot flame. What happens if you can't adjust the flame? Well done. It's a piece of leather. Not how I like my steak. The moral of the story is adjusting the flame is where it's at. And it's very hard for athletes or people in general to do this when you're in the middle of an activity, because all of the things that happen that would normally tell you that you're angry, your heart rate goes up, your breathing rate goes up, muscle tension, you're sweating, all of those things are the same thing that happen normally when you're playing sports. So how do you know if you're angry or you're just physiologically aroused? What changes is your thoughts. If your thoughts move from executing my play to hitting her over the head with a bat, then you know we went over there, right? You also want to realize that sometimes you're the last person to know how angry you are. So in team sports, and you also want to educate coaches, you want people to be able to identify when someone looks like they're escalating too much. Yank them, sit them down, cool out, and come back to play. Right? It's not about punishment. It's you've lost, you're no longer near the zone. All right, so if we put it all together, sorry, my Brooklyn came out. Some sports psychology research implicates athletes as more violent. Ready? If anybody's done their homework, there are some studies that show that athletes are more likely to rank higher on delinquency, levels of anger, higher incidence of sexual violence, higher levels of rape-supportive attitudes. Anybody do research? 1985. Earhart and Sandler documented 50 group rape incidents. Of these, 30% involved athletes. What should that number be? Why wasn't that reported as 70% of the people were not athletes? Because most of the people that study this have an agenda. Doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just puts them in a really poor position to be as objective with the data as they could be. Theoretically, for any of you stats fans, that should have been a chi-squared analysis to determine whether or not that percentage is what it should have been compared to random sampling. Same thing in this situation. 1/3 of 862 sexual attacks on college campuses. I'm not for a second trying to tell you that athletes don't do this. This is all over the place. The problem is the research is misleading and confusing, not to mention the fact that most sexual assaults don't get reported in the first place. How do you think all this research is done? Questionnaires. That's a good way to find out whether or not somebody was really sexually assaulted. In fact, if you want to talk about people that have higher levels of anger, you can make an argument that the people that score higher on anger measures are less likely to act out on it because they're aware of it. Make you scratch your head. Nonetheless, we need to be sensitive. And again, I'm not saying that the research is wrong. I'm just saying that there's limitations to it. Self-report measures in prison, I never use a self-report measure. You know why? They tell me what the person wants me to know. That's very different from how they might be. So I use different tools. There's also the issue of whether or not attitudes promote behavior. If I rank high on rape-supportive attitudes, does that equal I'm a rapist? No. And if you want to go look at some interesting research, go take a look at the racism research. A whole lot of people will, when they're filling out questionnaires, will own their prejudices, but they don't necessarily act on them. So it's important to remember, if you're doing research, attitude does not predict behavior. Criminal records, well, we're talking about athletes, right? So is that arrests? Is that convictions? Are you still in America and you're innocent until proven guilty? The point I'm making is that this is tremendously hard to study. But many of the conclusions about athletes are similar to those made about fraternities. I am not convinced that it has anything to do with throwing a ball or having a Greek letter on your jacket. It has to do with the factors that those groups have in common. And that's what we should be focusing on. It's not really about sports. And if you want to be complete about it, you could find literature that says the other things. Sexual assault, sexual and physical aggression against women by college male athletes. In this particular study, findings suggest that involvement in contact versus non-contact sports may not contribute to higher levels of aggression. But nobody talks about that. There was also a study in 1997. There was no significant difference between athletes and non-athletes on aggressive sexual behavior. Somehow the media never got that study. If you want to learn about violence, remember two things. Don't trust the media and follow the dollar. Okay? Because that's going to take you to where the answers are. Findings suggest that characteristics of athletes rather than athletic participation alone must be considered further in examining the presumed link between athletes and sexual assaults, which is exactly what I just said. It's not about playing ball. It's about the factors that some athletes have. Some. Now, you should know, don't think I'm letting athletes off the hook, because there's things in athlete culture that can contribute to violence that we need to address. I'm trying to give you some background. In 1998, Jeffrey Benedict and Don Yeager wrote a book called Pros and Cons of Criminals Who Play in the NFL. Interestingly enough, Jeffrey Benedict, I think, worked with Richard Lapchick for a little while in the Northeastern's study for society and sport. But this is how data gets confusing. They estimated that approximately 21% of the players in NFL have been charged with a serious crime. And this is how they defined it. Only 16% of those charged were convicted, which is actually not so different from what happens with most arrest rates. You get a very low percentage of convictions. You get a lot of plea bargains, a lot of acquittals. This is the piece that people don't talk about, though. 509 were researched regarding criminal history. Of those, 109 were found to have been charged with a serious crime, thus 21%, right? There's only one problem. How many players played in the NFL that year? Almost 1,600. Now you're talking 7%, which is lower than what you see in arrest rates for the non-athletes. There are several members of the media that have been tracking this. Since 2000, the San Diego Union Tribune has found 573 NFL players arrested for things bigger than speeding. That's an arrest rate of 1 in every 45 players. But if you compare it to non-athletes, that rate is 1 in 23. And probably the best way to depict it, this is actually from USA Today, NFL player arrests. Before you get confused, blue is NFL. The red or the orange is the national average. You see anything that athletes do more than non-athletes? I don't. The only places that are close are here, sex offenses. Something you should know about sex offense research, it's something called a low base rate crime. Low base rate crimes are very hard to study. So when we're doing sexual assault risk assessment, what we're trying to do is figure out whether or not this person has a higher likelihood to recidivate. And we're pretty good at that. But it's kind of like tracking tornadoes in like Oklahoma. We know there's going to be a certain amount of tornadoes, but good luck figuring out when it's going to touch down, who's going to do it and how. So the point is that we know sexual assaults happen, but it's very difficult for us to figure out who and how. There's research that's underway right now that's trying to figure that out. The point I'm making is that if you go across all of these, same thing, murder right here, low base rate, you're talking about microscopic numbers. It's undeniable that even pro athletes that have all kinds of entitlements, money to burn, great agents, they simply don't get arrested and convicted more often than non-athletes. The media does not present it that way. So, violence problems in the United States? You betcha. Domestic violence, dating violence, random violence, you name it. School violence. Why would you not think that there's going to be violence in sports? Is that the same thing as athletes are more violent than non-athletes? No. Okay. For those historians in the group, anybody know why the NCAA was formed in the first place? Because people were getting killed playing football. You want to feel really old? Teddy Roosevelt was the person who formed the NCAA. Mostly Ivy League teams, people were getting killed. The NCAA was originally formed to curb violence in sports. Very different from what their themes and missions are now. Remember when I said that you have to follow the dollar? When you talk about billions, if not trillion-dollar TV contracts, you think that's not going to cloud people's judgment sometimes? For those of you who think that Ray Rice shouldn't be playing after he was arrested, or Greg Hardy shouldn't have been playing after he was arrested, you need to understand that those decisions are not based on morality. They're based on business. And if you don't want him playing, stop watching the damn TV. Stop going to games, stop buying beers, because when the sponsorship says they're going away, that's when you start shaping behavior. Okay? All right. Have I convinced you yet? Maybe not. This is the bottom line. One victim is too many. So it doesn't matter if athletes are more violent than non-athletes. If you take a look at sexual assault statistics, 1 out of every 4 females will be the survivor of sexual assault at some time in their life. And for guys who don't think it's their issue, it's 1 out of 6 for you. But I would tell you it doesn't matter if it's 1 in 7 gazillion if you're that one. So the statistics matter because it gives us an idea of how proliferated a problem is. But the fact of me saying athletes are not more violent than non-athletes doesn't mean that we say we're not going to do anything to prevent athletes from being violent. We need to try to stop violence across the board. And if you're going to work with athletes to try to prevent them from transgressing, they're going to need specific programming because athletes are a subpopulation that have different things in their culture than non-athletes. Okay? We can certainly do more. It's also important to understand, as you probably know, as you guys are all here today, that athletes don't exist on an island. They work inside a system. Whether it's a pro athlete or a youth sport athlete or anything in between, there are many people that are very influential. So if we're going to talk about making change, we need to do a multi-system approach. We have to work with parents, we have to work with coaches, we have to work with athletes, we have to work with non-athletes. And by the way, many people that are involved in youth sport drop out before they get to high school. The numbers of what percentage of people get to play NCAA sports are very, very low. Remember earlier I was asking you whether or not you thought competition was good or bad, and you guys were a little bit hesitant, but most people agreed that competition is a good thing when you're ready. Competition can be very, very damaging before the psychology of the young person is ready to handle it. You know, it brings up the question of whether or not there should be trophies for participation. You want to know what I think about that? Not in unison. No, you don't care. Okay. I'm going to tell you anyway. The younger the child, the more valuable trophies for participation are. Sports for kids should be about fun and learning skills and playing with your friends. You throw a ball inside a bunch of kids, they're going to have a blast until the adults come over and screw it up. One of the nice things about there being so many sports programs out there these days is that parents don't have to tolerate bad coaching. Oh, I'm sorry, many of the bad coaches are parents. What does it take to be a parent these days? Nothing. Same way as it's always been. But when you have a parent that's damaging their own child, as bad as that is, how much does that magnify when they're hurting other children as well? And you should be aware that it works in both directions. There are some parents that frankly should not have kids. It's the truth. I worked on an adolescent unit, and the assistant unit chief said to me, Mitch, because I wasn't a doctor yet, he made sure I knew that, what do you think's going on with these kids? I said, I don't know. I've done worse stuff than they did. He said, did you ever get caught? No. And if you did, would your parents have taken care of it? Mm-hmm. A lot of these kids need a parentectomy. Parents don't know what the hell they're doing. It's not their fault. But just as we don't want to admit that we're angry, we also don't want to admit that we don't know what we're doing with our kids. And there are some coaches out there that save those kids' lives. Nobody wants to talk about all the kids that would be in jail or dead if it weren't for a coach that saved them. So we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But again, swings the other direction. You got some child molesters as coaches, all the way up to USA swimming, diving, pro levels, junior levels. It's all over the place. And the new solution is we're going to run background checks. That's the way we'll protect our young people. Newsflash, background checks don't work unless you were caught once. Think about that for a second. We have background checks, so therefore we know our kids are safe. We don't know that. Sports represent an opportunity for all kinds of great things happening and also the worst that society can offer. Interventions have to deal with the whole system. Okay, I want to shift for a second. We're moving towards interventions. Someone give me time when you get a chance. Okay. So here we go. Tell me if you agree with any of these or disagree with any of these. Factors in male athlete culture that may increase violence in athletes. Misogyny and pathological masculinity. The idea that guys can have whatever they want. It's a patriarchal world and women are just here to serve us. Fragile male ego, which is the other side of the same coin, of course. The low self-esteem males who think that they know what the hell they're doing, and they're rather pathetic, honestly. There's a sense of entitlement because people have been giving you things from the time you're very small. The belief that coach will fix it. Now, I can tell you that that's happening a little bit less than it used to be. It would be nice to believe that that's a moral thing. I'm not sure that that's moral either. I think it has to do with coaches being concerned about keeping their jobs. And they are not going to keep their jobs if they have major scandals in their school and recruitment goes down. Surprisingly, some parents don't want to send their children to schools where sexual assaults happen. But not as much as you'd think. Alcohol and drug use. In fact, alcohol is sometimes used specifically as a weapon to disinhibit people and make them more likely to be vulnerable. There's a lack of consequences. How hard it is to get a prosecution for a sexual assault is an embarrassment. The difference between an explanation and an excuse, you talk to a bunch of guys and they'll say, oh, she wanted it, she gave me mixed messages. Nonsense. Men have to be educated about what consent is. For those of you guys that are out there, take a look at the laws. I promise you, you will be surprised. And if you think that they're not fair, you should think about how fair it is that there's been decades, centuries of sexual violence victims that have not been able to recover as a result of the things that have happened to them. Concussions. Concussions don't cause sexual assault any more than steroids cause violence. However, if you have somebody that already is geared towards engaging in that behavior and they have concussions, the frontal lobe, the part of the brain that's supposed to say, hey, that's a dumb idea, don't do it, might not be there to help you. So those that have concussions might be disinhibited the same way as people that are under the influence of alcohol. You could even make an argument that collision sports athletes, you'd expect them to be engaging in sexual assault more commonly because they're desensitized to physicality. It's really surprising to me. When I saw those numbers, I thought that athletes would be up at least as much as everyone else, which tells us that there are more athletes that have better self-control than anybody's talking about, but that's not good press. There's also the selective reinforcement of criminal behavior. So if we're going to make interventions, and this is really where the rubber hits the road, because you're going to have to take this with you and change the world that you're living in. We want to start with youth sports. A code of conduct. In my book, I talk about, actually, I share a code of conduct from a Boston area school that I think captures it nicely. But even more importantly than having a code of conduct that demands the behavior of athletes, wouldn't it be nice if the parents and the coaches had to follow that same code? And there has to be zero tolerance, because if you do not reinforce it consistently, people will know and they'll break the rules. It's like a slot machine. Like I said before, the younger they are, the less winning matters. Emphasize process over product. If I see an 8-year-old kid tell me about their batting average, I feel sad. Tell me you had a good time. How was that pizza after the game? Right? What was the best moment? When I walked on the field and I smelled the grass. And then I got hit in the head with the ball. Right? You ever watch young kids play soccer? You know, they're following the bees following the hive. Is that not the funniest thing in the world? Kids, man, kids in sports, it's like peanut butter and jelly. It's good stuff. We need to increase emotional awareness, normalize it, and teach modulation for the coaches, for the parents, and for the athletes. And when we teach them that, it's not because we're wagging our finger at them and telling them to stop being idiots. It's because we're going to actually help them be better at what they're trying to do. You see, you have to package it in a way that people want to hear it. Otherwise, they feel like you're just talking down to them. Accountability has to be the theme that goes through any intervention. Any intervention. All right. I'm going to end with some recommendations. Now, you should know that this is a non-exhaustive list. Most perpetrators of sexual assault are males. It's a fact. A lot of that comes from men having really an antiquated, obsolete, and bluntly stupid idea of what it is to be a man. And guess who's teaching them that? Remember I told you that the bad coaches are coaching the way they were coached? There's a lot of guys out there that are teaching boys the wrong ideas of what it is to be a man. And the stupid thing about it is, the guys that are teaching boys to be men like that, they're not that socially successful. It's like catcalling. It's never worked. It's never worked. Right? So if you take a look at what men are successful, men that are socially successful are confident, they're intelligent, they have a sense of humor, they have social skills. Somebody that has to take it is not a man. And men that are teaching men that are completely clueless. But if you put them in a group where people can be de-individuated and add some alcohol, you have instant idiot. So if most of the perpetrators are men, then we have to, as men, change what the concept and the definition of masculinity is. Men have no idea what the legalities of consent are. Men are ignorant, not stupid, usually. Ideas such as forcible compulsion, the idea that alcohol takes away someone's ability to give consent. And you'll hear guys say, well, what about if we were both equally drunk? It depends on the state, on how they define sexual assault. Theoretically, if you were drunk and she was drunk and you didn't want to have sex and you called the police and you said that she raped you, she could be arrested. Doesn't happen very often, but it's possible. People that are unconscious cannot give consent. Oh, and by the way, those folks who think sexting is funny, 24-hour news cycle, people, there is no such thing as temporary. Everything is permanent. You get a job, they're going to be looking at the stupid picture you sent to someone when you were 15 years old. The idea of sexuality becoming so casual that we have no respect for personal boundaries, I would advise you guys to do something that's very complicated for young people these days. It's a real challenge. I want you to have a conversation with someone. I don't even care if it's on the phone. Actually talk to one another instead of texting. Whoever told me that emoticons capture how I'm feeling, I've had more arguments about what I've said in a text than anything I've ever said to someone's face. We have to improve the ability to communicate. We need to target the factors, not the group. Saying athletes are violent is ridiculous. Saying that Greeks are violent is ridiculous. The issue is that sex offenders are a heterogeneous group. It's not a single group of people with a single group of factors. We need to study those factors and obliterate them, very simply. But when you start identifying a group as equivalent to, all you're doing is prejudicing against people, marginalizing them, and make them less receptive to hearing what needs to be heard. Not to mention the fact that little Johnny really doesn't act that way when he's on his own. There are a lot of people that have good moral compasses, and then when they're in a group, they become dumb. That's a real factor. Bystander education, the intervention models, I'm foreshadowing. See how I did that? They're great if you can get someone to stand up. But the larger the group of people, the more likely it is I'm going to rely on somebody else to do the right thing. People forget that bystander intervention came from the bystander effect, which was about the diffusion of responsibility. I want people to be individually accountable. I'm not waiting for someone else to be responsible for my behavior. If you have the courage to step up and say something, good for you. Because if one does, more will. But I'm not going to rely on that. I'm going to rely on teaching people about accountability and maybe a little bit of something what your life will be like in prison. I could tell you a lot of stories about that. I don't think we have enough tape for that. Consequences for all involved. Whether it's the victim, the perpetrator, the institution, nobody is unscathed. So it's all of our issues. All of ours. We need to improve prevention programs, treatment for victims and offenders. You ever notice that one? We're going to accuse a guy of doing something. He's guilty but not convictable. They know he did it, but you're not going to get it in a court of law. But we're not going to do anything to treat him. You know what that does? More victims. We also have risk assessment protocols that can be used to determine what factors go into someone's criminal behavior, some of which are amenable to change, and decrease the likelihood of perpetrators' recidivism. The last thing I'm going to say is that I believe that one of the factors, and we talked about this earlier and there was some disagreement, and I can appreciate the disagreement. A lot of people that are victims of sexual assault don't want to come forward for a lot of different reasons. We need to be more available. All of us need to be more available, to be supportive, to empower people. The treatment for trauma is empowerment. You don't help somebody who's been victimized by telling them what they have to do with their lives now. But one of the things that's an obstacle for folks is they're afraid to come forward because they're afraid it won't go anywhere. On college campuses, very often campus security reports to the dean of students, and that person's responsibility is to make sure that the brand is protected. So let's instead have sworn law enforcement agents investigate crimes who actually can get data and evidence and get a rape kit, regardless of how difficult that is. But if you don't have good chain of evidence, there's no way you're going to get a prosecution. Now that we've had some light conversation, I would contend that the idea that athletes are more violent than non-athletes is a myth. Nonetheless, athletes are an at-risk population for several reasons, and therefore they need special programming specific to what the student-athlete's lifestyle is, or the pro-athlete, depending on the level you're dealing with. Sports are ubiquitous in our media culture. It's everywhere. Being involved in sport does not guarantee better moral character, so don't raise athletes and coaches up on a pedestal. They put their pants on the same way as you and I do, okay? And most importantly, keep talking about this. We have a long way to go. 30 and 40 years, we haven't come that far. Let's start making some progress. I'll say that again. Let's start making some progress. Thank you.
We will now begin the question and answer session. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to reach you. We do offer the first couple of questions to our students before opening it up to the rest of the audience. We will now take the first question.
I left them speechless. Question in the back.
Hi. So I just kind of want to hear your comment about, do you remember like the NFL scandal a couple years ago with Chris Carter telling the rookies to have a fall guy? Yes. I mean, I really like football, but I just wanted to hear your kind of comment on like how that kind of plays into what the NFL is doing to their younger players.
Well, it wasn't their finest moment. The Rookie Symposium has actually been discontinued. And it's been disseminated to be a more local club issue. Interestingly enough, the NFL has done more than people realize. Unfortunately, it was reactionary and late, but they've been doing a lot to try to make changes. I think that one of the problems is that they have more advocates and attorneys than treatment providers that are involved in this. I think it's a very difficult issue because professional sports are really much more about business than they are about morality. It's not easy. Let's also keep in mind, Commissioner Goodell was the first commissioner in any sport that had the courage to suspend somebody without due process, without criminal process, which the unions were not happy about. So I think that there is movement in the right direction, but still more to go. There's a lot that's going on behind the scenes that people don't know about. And I do think that what Chris Carter said actually has some benefit if you adjust it in a different way. Do you guys know what Chris Carter said? What did Chris Carter say?
He said that you have to have a fall guy within like a crew, so if you get in trouble, then he's going to take the fall for you instead of.
So one of the things that I've developed and I've been working on for a while is called entourage training. You take one person from their group and their job is to keep your butt out of trouble. Not be a fall guy, prevent it. Most things that happen are predictable. How any athlete gets arrested for DUI right now is ridiculous. And by the way, all of the professional sports leagues have car services available for them. So it's hard to get a DUI, and you do anyway, right? So the point I'm making is with entourage training, the idea is you're going to take someone and educate them about gang identification, conflict resolution, where to go, where not to go. You're the driver. You're the designated driver. Sometimes you learn self-defense. Heaven forbid, there's actually somebody that has training to carry a firearm and make you safe. So the idea of having someone in your group that's going to help you be safe is a good idea. That's not exactly the same as what Chris Carter was saying, but it's actually in the same direction. What he was trying to say is you have to find ways to stay out of trouble, but blaming someone else is not the way to go do it.
Back when you said that all kids should get trophies, including the worst players on the team or the worst teams in the league, regardless of how much fun they had, do you think that it teaches kids that poor performance is acceptable?
How do you define poor performance?
Well, if you're the worst player on the team and the worst team in the league, and you still get a trophy, I guess they think that's okay.
Do you think that the worst player on the World Series team should get a ring?
Yeah.
Then you answered your question. Not to mention, by the way, that we're also talking about kids. You know, I mean, and maybe I wasn't clear, and if I wasn't, let me clarify. I don't think that trophies for participation are the way to go across time. And actually, you know something, I'm glad you asked that question, because I really didn't make a point that I wanted to. You know, there are cultures that don't even try toilet training until the kid's 2.5, 3 years old. And the reasons why are because in order to toilet train, you need bodily control, motivation, and language skills. So if you try to toilet train a kid before that, it could be really difficult on everyone. Same thing with dealing with competition. If I had my druthers, competition wouldn't get cutthroat until middle school. Because by the time you get to middle school, probably about 99% of the kids can psychologically handle the rigors of losing. There's a tremendous difference between losing and being a loser. Okay? So the younger the kids, yeah, I'm fine with trophies for participation. As competition gets as the competition level goes up, there's going to be a thinning of the herd. And under those circumstances, I can appreciate the argument against participation trophies. But until the worst player on the championship team doesn't get a ring, that's a tough sell.
Hi, I wanted to make a comment about your charts about the Yerkes-Dodson law. I was just a little bit confused because when I've learned about that subject, it has always been in terms of arousal and stress, and I'm just wondering how you made the jump from talking about stress and arousal to using it as an explanation for aggression being positive in sports.
It's not about aggression, it's about emotion. Anger is an emotion. Anger is an emotion that has physiological arousal. So there's a relationship between arousal and performance. It's not, you know, keep in mind, think of it very behaviorally. We're talking about positivity. We're not talking about good and bad. We're talking about increasing or decreasing. So there is a curvilinear relationship between emotional arousal and performance.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I guess that ends tonight's event. Please join me in thanking Dr. Mitch Abrams.
If anybody has anything they want to say to me, I'll be here. Or email, or tweet, or call, or send up smoke signals, or actually have a conversation. Thank you for your time, guys.